Welcome to Reformed Thinking. It is great to have you with us for another session. I am your host, and I'm here with my co-host and expert guide as we get ready to tackle another stack of research and theological notes.
It is good to be here. And as always, we're coming at our subject today from a pretty specific vantage point. We're standing on the heritage of the Reformation, holding to the Westminster Confession of Faith, and, looking to Scripture as the final word for how we live and how we run the church.
Today we're opening up a file that feels, incredibly urgent. If you just look at the headlines coming out of the Western Church over the last few years, you see a lot of collapse. You see leaders falling, scandals. It can be pretty disheartening, really.
Yeah.
So we're going back to the source code today. We're looking at the qualifications for elders, and we're zeroing in on the very first requirement listed in 1 Timothy 3.2 and also in Titus 1.67. The phrase is above reproach.
It's a weighty phrase. And just to give everyone a roadmap, we're pulling from two main sources today. Above reproach, the foundational qualification for elders, and the shield of the church. And both of these texts, they make a really compelling case that this qualification isn't just item 1 on a list, it's the governing headline for the whole office.
That concept, governing headline, that really stopped me in my tracks when I was reading through the material.
Yeah.
I think most of us, when we see a list of requirements like, husband of one wife, sober-minded, hospitable, able to teach, we treat it like a rubric for a job interview.
Right, like a checklist.
Yeah, checklist. You check the boxes, you tally the score, and if he gets enough points, he gets the job. But you're saying the structure is different.
It operates in a completely different way. The argument here is that above reproach is the umbrella. It's the summary statement. Every single qualification that follows. How a man treats his wife, how he manages his money, how he controls his temper. Those are just the specific data points that prove he is, in fact, above reproach.
So if he fails in one of those specific areas,
Then he hasn't just failed a subpoint. He's failed the headline requirement. The whole thing falls apart.
okay, before we get into the weeds of what that looks like, I want to ask about the necessity of this. The sources point out that in 1 Timothy 3.2, there's a specific Greek word that Paul uses that sort of frames this whole conversation. It's the word day.
Yes, day. It's a tiny word with massive implications. It translates to must. An overseer must be above reproach. Now, we need to be careful with how we hear that in English. In our modern context, must can sometimes feel like a strong suggestion.
Right, like you really must try this restaurant, or we really must get together sometime. It just means it's a good idea.
Exactly. It's a strong preference. But in the Greek New Testament, this term, day, it denotes a kind of logical and divine necessity. It's closer to how we might talk about a lot of physics, like an object in motion must stay in motion. It's not Paul saying, ideally, it'd be great if your elders were decent guys.
No, it's a non-negotiable.
It is. He's saying that in God's economy, this is a non-negotiable state of being. If a man doesn't have this quality, you don't just have a flawed elder, you have someone who, in the eyes of Scripture, isn't an elder at all.
The stakes feel incredibly high right from that first verb. And the source material connects this must to the very nature of the church itself. Later in that same letter, 1 Timothy 3.15, Paul calls the church the pillar and buttress of the truth.
And that's the context we have to keep in our minds. We're not just talking about corporate hiring practices or, filling a slot on an org chart. If the church is the pillar holding up the truth of the gospel for a watching world to see, then the leaders of that church are the visible supports of that pillar.
So if the leaders are compromised,
If the elder is scandalous, the truth itself appears unstable to the people watching. We aren't just protecting a man's career or a church's reputation. We're safeguarding the credibility of the gospel message itself.
So let's unpack the mechanics of this term. What does above reproach actually mean? Because I have to be honest, to my modern ear, it sounds impossible. It sounds like you have to be perfect. If I'm sitting in the pew thinking, well, I got angry in traffic this morning, I'm already out. But the sources, they give us a really fascinating breakdown of the Greek word used here, anepilēptos.
This is one of the most vivid images in the New Testament, and I wish more people understood where it comes from. The word anepilēptos is a compound word. It literally means not able to be taken hold of, or not able to be seized.
The source material brings up a wrestling metaphor here that I found so helpful to visualize this.
It's a fantastic visual. In the ancient world, this word would immediately bring to mind the image of a wrestler in the gymnasium. So picture two men, they're oiled up, sweating, grappling with each other. The whole point of wrestling is to find a handle.
Right.
You're looking for a wrist, an ankle, a loose piece of clothing, anything you can grab to get leverage and throw your opponent to the ground.
So if a wrestler is an anepilēptos,
It means he offers no handle. He's smooth. Every time his opponent reaches out to grab him, their hand just slips off.
Yeah.
There's no rough edge, no loose garment, nothing to get a grip on.
wow, that is a powerful image. So applying that spiritually to a pastor or an elder, it means he has to live a life that offers no handle to the enemy.
You've got it. The opponent in this spiritual sense is, often the accuser, Satan, or just broadly the critics of the church out in the world. An elder has to live in such a way that when someone tries to drag him down and by extension drag the church down with him, they just can't find a grip.
So they can't find a secret vice, a hidden financial issue.
A pattern of lying, a history of duplicity, nothing. He's unassailable.
Now, there's a related term in Titus 1.6, anepilēptos, which we often translate as blameless. The sources distinguish this a little from the wrestling term. This one's more forensic, like courtroom language.
That's a great way to put it. Anepilēptos is legal language. It means not chargeable. And we have to be really, really careful here to understand what this does and does not mean. It does not mean that no one will ever accuse the man. That's just not realistic.
No, of course not. Jesus himself was accused of all sorts of things, being a drunkard, a glutton.
Exactly. Blasphemy.
Yeah.
Simply being accused doesn't make you guilty. We live in a world where, anyone can say anything online.
Sure.
So not chargeable means that when the accusation is brought forward and when it's investigated by reasonable people and held up to the light of truth, the charge doesn't stick. There's no evidence to support a conviction. It means the man's life is lived in such a way that a credible indictment just can't be sustained against him.
I want to pause here because I can hear the objection forming in some listeners' minds. And frankly, it's an objection the source material sees coming a mile away. If the standard is no handle and no charge that sticks, are we asking for sinless perfection? Because if we are, then nobody can serve. The Apostle John tells us in 1 John 1.8, if we say we have no sin, we deceive ourselves. So how do we square above reproach with the fact that every man is a sinner?
That is the crucial theological distinction we have to make. We are absolutely not talking about sinless perfection. The Reformed tradition has always been very clear on this. What we're doing is we're contrasting remaining sin with reigning scandal.
Remaining sin versus reigning scandal. Okay, let's dig into that distinction.
Every Christian, and that includes every elder, has remaining sin. We all stumble, we all have moments of impatience or selfish thoughts or flashes of pride. But a reigning scandal or a reigning sin is different. It's a settled pattern of character that openly contradicts the gospel he confesses.
So an elder might lose his temper.
He might. But does he immediately humble himself, go apologize to his family or his session, and seek the Spirit's help? Or is he known as a bully? Is that his reputation? That's the difference.
So it's about the trajectory and the pattern of the life, not just a single isolated stumble.
It's about integrity. Integrity means wholeness. It means the man you see in the pulpit on Sunday is the same man you see at his dinner table on Tuesday. It doesn't mean he never sins, but it does mean he doesn't hide his sin, he doesn't rationalize it, and he isn't characterized by sins that bring public disgrace. When he does sin, he deals with it in a way that lines up with the very gospel he preaches.
That brings us to the arenas, where this blamelessness has to be proven. And the sources point out that Paul doesn't just leave this as a vague concept. He points to very specific places where we should go looking for these handles. And the first one, which might make some people a little nervous, is the household.
It is the ultimate proving ground. Paul asks this a really logical question in 1 Timothy 3.5. He says, if someone does not know how to manage his own household, how will he care for God's church? The logic moves from the lesser to the greater.
Right, if a man can't shepherd the 3 or 4 people living under his own roof who he sees every day,
how can he possibly shepherd the whole flock of God? It's the first test.
the text mentions being the husband of one wife and having children who are not open to the charge of debauchery or insubordination. This can be a really sensitive topic, especially the part about the children. I think a lot of people wonder, does this mean if my teenager rebels, I lose my job?
We need to look at that really closely. Husband of one wife definitely speaks to marital fidelity. I mean, sexual integrity is one of the most common ways that leaders give the enemy a handle. but it also speaks to a singular devotion.
Okay.
As for the children, the source material is careful to clarify this is not a demand for the children to be regenerate Christians. An elder cannot guarantee the salvation of his kids. Salvation is from the Lord.
Of course, you can't force your child to believe.
You can't. But the requirement is that his home isn't characterized by riotous chaos or open insubordination. The Greek here indicates a kind of wild, dissolute life that the father is either ignoring or maybe even enabling. The home is where leadership is least performative.
That's a good way to put it.
You can fake it on a stage for an hour on Sunday. You can put on the suit and the smile. You can't fake it with your teenagers for 10 years. If the home is a place of chaos or neglect or hypocrisy, the man is disqualified no matter how eloquent his theology is.
So, moving from the home to the man's own temperament, the sources call these the vices of authority. I thought that was a very insightful phrase.
Vices of authority is a great way to put it. Paul specifically targets things like arrogance, a quick temper, violence, and being a drunkard. And you have to ask why these specific things, because these are the corruptions that latch themselves onto power. When a man is given authority, the temptation is to use it to dominate, to bully, or to indulge himself.
It's interesting because often in the corporate world, or even in some church growth models, the strong leader is prized. You know, the guy who takes charge, who's aggressive, maybe he breaks a few eggs to make an omelet. But Paul seems to be saying that if you're a brawler or pugnacious, you're out.
A man who is quarrelsome or a bully is disqualified. It doesn't matter if he's right in his theological argument. If his disposition is violent, either physically or just verbally, he's not above reproach. An elder is a shepherd, not a CEO who drives results through intimidation. The requirement is to be gentle, self-controlled.
So if you have a pastor who screams at his staff,
Or belittles people who disagree with him in a meeting, he is offering a massive handle to the enemy. He's disqualified.
then there's money. Not a lover of money, not greedy for gain.
Greed is a subtle handle. It usually shows up in things like manipulative fundraising or really opaque church finances, or using the ministry to build a personal lifestyle that's completely disconnected from the reality of the flock. A lover of money will eventually compromise the truth because the truth often costs you money. If your main drive is personal gain, you'll soften the message when that message threatens the donor base.
There's one more arena that the sources emphasize, and I think it's one we often overlook or even dismiss. 1 Timothy 3.7 says an elder must be well thought of by outsiders.
Yes. This is fascinating, isn't it?
It is, because I can imagine a listener saying, wait a minute, Jesus said the world will hate us. Why should I care if the non-believing world likes my pastor?
That is a critical distinction to make. The source explains that this does not mean the world has to like his theology. They might hate the gospel, they might find the cross offensive, but they should not be able to look at the man himself and legitimately call him a crook or a liar or an adulterer.
So it's about his moral credibility, not his popularity.
That's it. The text says this is to avoid falling into disgrace and the snare of the devil. If a neighbor can say, oh, that pastor, he cheated me on a contracting job, or, yeah, I see him stumbling drunk at the bar every Friday, then the gospel he preaches is mocked. His reputation acts as a shield. And if that shield is broken, the mud that's thrown at the man hits the church.
That concept of the shield really gets to the heart of why this matters. And it leads us into the theological rationale, the why behind this high standard. It's not just about the man. It's about what he represents. The sources bring up the concept of the steward from Titus 1.7.
A steward is a manager of someone else's property. And this is so important to understand. The church does not belong to the elders. It belongs to Christ. The elder is managing God's household. And what's the number one requirement for a steward?
Fidelity.
Trustworthiness.
Fidelity. You wouldn't hire a bank manager who had a reputation for embezzlement no matter how charming he was. In the same way, God does not appoint stewards who bring shame on his house. Now, I want to get into a bit of the historical theology that was in the source material. I mentioned the Donatist heresy. This is where we need to put on our thinking caps because it gets a little technical, but it's so important for how we view the church. How does this above-reproach standard interact with the validity of the sacraments?
This is a vital nuance, especially for us holding to the Westminster Confession. The Donatists in the early church, this was back in the 4th and 5th centuries, they argued that if a priest was a sinner, or if he had compromised during persecution, then the religious acts he performed were null and void. So if a bad priest baptized you, you weren't actually baptized.
Which would be terrifying. Because you'd never know for sure if you were truly baptized. You'd have to be constantly investigating the secret life of your minister.
It creates total insecurity. It places the validity of God's grace on the moral performance of a human being. The Reformed view, following Augustine and the Westminster Confession, says no. The validity of the sacraments, baptism, and the Lord's Supper depends on Christ's promise and the Holy Spirit, not the piety of the minister.
So if an elder baptizes my child and later turns out to be a scoundrel,
The baptism is still valid. The gold of the sacrament is not ruined by the dirty hands of the postman delivering it.
however, and this is a big however, isn't it?
It is a very big, however. While the sacrament is valid, the man is disqualified. We do not say, oh, well, the sacrament works, so it doesn't really matter how he lives. No, he forfeits his office. We demand holiness not to make the mechanics of grace work, but to make the ministry credible and, frankly, safe for the sheep.
It protects the flock. That's the key.
That's it. A reproachable man is a danger to the spiritual health of the people. Even if his administration of the sacraments is technically valid, he confuses the people about the character of God.
And this brings us right into the conflict we see today. The source material identifies several modern pressure points where the church is tempted to just ignore Paul's instructions. We've touched on the CEO model, but let's go a bit deeper.
Yeah.
Why do churches keep hiring these talented men who have obvious character flaws?
It's the idol of pragmatism. The question becomes, does it work? Instead of, is it holy? We see a man who is a vision caster, a dynamic speaker, someone who can draw a crowd, and we think, well, surely God's hand is on him because he's successful. We look at the numbers, the budget, the building program.
We confuse gifts with fruit.
That is the trap. We swap Paul's list, which is almost entirely about character, for the world's list, which is all about competency and charisma. And the danger, as the sources point out, is that hiring talent without testing character is like building a house on sand. Eventually, the cracks in the foundation, the lack of self-control, the pride will bring the whole structure crashing down. And the wreckage is usually devastating for everyone involved.
Another pressure point the sources mentioned is therapeutic minimalism. This is the tendency to rebrand disqualifying sins as just struggles or brokenness.
This is a pervasive issue in our culture, and it has just seeped into the church. Now, look, we want to be compassionate, but there's a world of difference between a Christian struggling against sin and a leader who is disqualified by sin. The source argues that repentance isn't just processing your feelings or admitting you're broken. It's turning away from the behavior. If a man has a pattern of violence or financial dishonesty, we can't just call that a struggle and leave him in the pulpit because he's being vulnerable about it.
It just diminishes the seriousness of the office.
And it endangers the sheep. If we treat disqualifying sins as mere brokenness, we're basically saying that character doesn't matter as long as you're honest about how messed up you are. But Paul says you must be above reproach. Vulnerability is not a substitute for integrity.
There's one more pressure point that the sources were very, very strong on, and it feels so relevant to recent news cycles: the privacy myth and the use of NDAs, non-disclosure agreements.
This is a critical point. The argument is that above reproach means living in the light. The source material takes an incredibly strong stance against using NDAs to hide moral failures in church leadership.
The logic being that if you have to legally bind someone to silence to protect the reputation of the leader, he is by definition already reproachable.
That is the reality. If you are hiding sin behind a legal wall, you are the very antithesis of anepilēptos. You're creating a handle, a scandal, and then paying lawyers to make sure nobody can grab it. But God sees it. The church is a public institution, and its leaders are public figures. Transparency is non-negotiable. You can't have a private life that contradicts your public ministry. An NDA that's designed to conceal sin is, in effect, a confession that the leader is not blameless.
So what happens when there's an accusation? Because we live in a messy world, the source material outlines a process, and it warns against falling into one of two ditches. What are those two ditches?
A first ditch is trial by gossip. This is believing every rumor, every tweet, every whisper that comes along. Paul guards against this in 1 Timothy 5.19 by requiring 2 or 3 witnesses. We don't ruin a man's life based on hearsay or anonymous email. There has to be due process and real evidence.
And the second ditch?
The second ditch is the cover-up. This is protecting the powerful. It's sweeping things under the rug to save the church's brand or protect a popular pastor. This is where we see sessions or boards ignoring credible evidence because they just don't want the scandal.
So how do we walk that middle path between those two?
We follow the biblical text. 1 Timothy 5.0 says that those elders who persist in sin must be rebuked in the presence of all.
That's a terrifying verse.
Mm-hmm.
In the presence of all. It sounds so harsh to our modern ears.
It is solemn, but it's necessary. Public sin requires public correction, and the reason Paul gives is so that the rest may stand in fear. It's a deterrent. It shows that God is holy and that the church does not play favorites. The source material really emphasizes that this has to be done without partiality. It doesn't matter how big the pastor's podcast is or how many books he's sold. If he's disqualified, he must be corrected. We cannot have a two-tiered justice system in the church.
And this leads to the really difficult question of restoration. The source makes a key distinction between restoration to fellowship and restoration to office.
This is where so many churches get confused. We believe in forgiveness. If a fallen elder repents, he is forgiven by Christ, and he should be welcomed to the Lord's table as a brother. He's restored to fellowship. But forgiveness does not equal requalification.
Because the office is based on trust and reputation, which have been broken.
That is the distinction. He may be forgiven, but he is no longer above reproach. He has lost the moral standing required to shepherd. Trust is the currency of leadership, and once it's been squandered like that, it may never be fully recovered for the purpose of the office, even if the man is fully restored to Christ.
So there are consequences to sin that forgiveness doesn't just erase.
Absolutely. A bank teller who steals money might be forgiven by the bank president, but he probably won't get his job back working at the vault.
We've covered the what, the where, the why, and the process, but I want to land where our sources land, which is on a Christological focus. Because if we just leave it there, it feels like a heavy burden of law, be perfect or else. But the sources point us to Christ as the true anepilēptos.
We have to end here. If we preach this standard without Christ, we just create either Pharisees or despairing hypocrites. Jesus is the only one who truly has no handle. He is the one described in Hebrews 7.26 as holy, innocent, unstained.
He's the only one the accuser could not get a grip on.
Even when Pilate tried him, what did he say? I find no guilt in him. Jesus is the substance. The elder is just the shadow. And the beauty of the gospel, as the sources highlight, is the great exchange. Christ took our reproach, our shame, our handles, our guilt upon himself on the cross so that we could be counted blameless in him.
So for the elder, this isn't just about white-knuckling it and trying harder to be a good person.
No, not at all. It's about union with Christ. An elder's integrity is a fruit that grows from abiding in the vine. He reflects the character of the chief shepherd because he's united to him. It's a derivative glory. The elder shines because he's standing in the light of Christ. It's the Spirit of Christ in him that produces the self-control, the gentleness, the fidelity.
That puts the pressure where it belongs on the grace of God at work in a man's life.
Indeed. It's not just willpower, it's grace from beginning to end.
As we wrap up this deep dive into Reformed thinking on the eldership, the sources leave us with a challenge. First, to the men listening.
The challenge to the men, whether you're an elder now, aspiring to be one, or just a man in the church, is to examine your life for handles. Where are the loose ends? Where are the secret indulgences? Deal with them now. Mortify them by the Spirit before they become a public snare. Don't wait for exposure to force the issue.
And to the church as a whole.
The challenge is to value character over charisma. When you are looking for leaders, don't look for the man who can hold a room captive. Look for the man whose life is captive to Christ. Look for the man who is boringly faithful. The standard is high because the church is precious. It was bought with the blood of Christ. We dare not entrust it to men who are not safe.
Boringly faithful. I like that. We could use a lot more boring faithfulness in the church today.
Amen to that.
Thank you for walking us through this. It is a sobering topic, but a joyful one when we realize it's all designed to protect the flock we love.
It is a shield indeed.
And thank you to our listeners for joining us on this edition of Reformed Thinking. We hope this conversation helps you uphold the pillar and buttress of the truth in your own local congregation. Until next time.